Hi, guys. Welcome to the HGR Digital Assets Group podcast, where we have Luis today from the Philippines. He is the co-founder of Bloom Solutions. He's the partner of Israel Keys. We had Israel back a few weeks ago. He was also one of our podcast guests. And from the last time that we spoke to Israel, we learned that Bloom Solutions is a startup company in the Philippines that aims to solve the problem of high fees in the remittance industry. Luis, how are you today?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for the invite.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Luis. I know it's a 12-hour difference from here in the Philippines, so we appreciate you staying with us pretty late at night. So the first question that I have is, can you tell us more about your background, maybe your academic training, your professional experience, and how you got into entrepreneurship in the cryptocurrency space?
Sure. Yeah. So, my background's actually pretty funny. I went to art school here in the Philippines, and I always envisioned, as a child, I always envisioned that I would kind of get into, the design industry or something along those lines. But what ended up happening was that, I went to university in the late 90s, right around the time that the internet was starting to become, a big thing. And I have to say that the first few moments I got online as a teenager here in the Philippines, I changed my mind about what I wanted to do for a living. I just wanted to build things for this new space. It just felt like this was going to be where everything important was going to happen. And to a certain extent, that is exactly what happened. The internet has kind of become a part of our lives in a way that maybe we didn't really envision back in the early or even late 90s. So I kind of came into it from a design perspective, but I taught myself programming. It was a little bit easier back then. I learned how to program in PHP, and eventually kind of moved into Ruby in the mid 2000s. So I was using Ruby on Rails during the early betas, and that was kind of how I started to become really focused on building professional web applications. I started my first startup here in the Philippines in 2006, I want to say. So about a little over a decade ago, and all of them internet startups. The last one before I discovered Bitcoin was an e-commerce startup. It was kind of a marketplace, sort of like a Philippine version of, I guess you could say, like eBay or something along those lines. So I built that, and I was trying to make it work as a young entrepreneur. And one of the biggest challenges that I found was that there wasn't enough credit card penetration at the time here in the Philippines in order to kind of make a platform like that really profitable. There's still not that much credit card penetration here, but I came away from that experience looking for a way for countries like the Philippines, where not a lot of people have bank accounts and not a lot of people have credit cards. I came away from the experience looking for a solution for that, which is kind of how I found Bitcoin in 2014. I originally started looking at it like it was a solution for online payments that didn't require you to have any kind of credit card history or any kind of relationship with a bank or financial institution. I thought that was a very democratizing kind of thing to have access to. Now, granted, that's not exactly what happened to Bitcoin. It's still arguable whether anyone really uses it for online payments. I'm sure there are many people who might disagree with that, but at least on this side of the world, it's not particularly common to be using Bitcoin to pay for your, whatever it is that you buy on places like Amazon, or I guess over here we have things like Lazada or Zalora, which are rocket internet companies, but very similar. So that's not exactly what Bitcoin is being used for, but that was kind of how I first got into it, and that was kind of the first version of the business that we started looking into. It was kind of along those lines.
That's great to hear. I think your background is quite unorthodox, but it's super unique, and it's very easy to remember. I think going to art school, ultimately you focus on design, and as an entrepreneur, you're sort of a designer yourself. I think in both art and entrepreneurship, it's about telling stories. It's about building sculptures, whether it's financial structure or whether it's brass or like metal art sculptures. I think the skill set that you need to succeed in entrepreneurship closely resemble that of an artist, right? So that's super insightful from your end. I think it's also like super cool that you have coding experience. Yeah, Ruby is one of the more famous programming languages. Just curious, do you also program on Solidity or just?
Oh no, so So Ruby and JavaScript were kind of the last two languages that I learned as an engineer. These days, I mostly just focus on business development and partnerships. I do a lot of conferences, like I speak at conferences or give workshops. So my role is becoming more and more kind of just talking about what we're doing, trying to find partners and customers for our business, and just educating the general public about crypto and how they could possibly use it to make their lives a little easier. So I guess I've kind of moved back into I've come full circle in a way where like as you said, art is kind of very much around telling stories, and that's very much the role that I have with Bloom right now. Communicating our mission and educating people about a fairly complex piece of subject matter is there is a certain amount of skill required to simplify something that is fairly opaque for a lot of folks.
Yeah, I totally agree with those. And bring up your last point on how Bitcoin was traditionally envisioned as maybe a medium of exchange. I was listening to a talk by Brad Garlinghouse recently, the CEO of Ripple, and he was saying that you can't really pay for coffee using your Bitcoin because it takes like a transaction fee of like more than $30 to $40 now, given Bitcoin's success, and it takes a transaction processing time of like over an hour. So he was saying you can't pay for your coffee because the coffee will get cold by the time this transaction is done. So that was pretty funny.
Well, I mean, I think that's changing. I think that those statements were definitely true. Like as recently as maybe late last year, that was definitely true, and I wouldn't have argued with him. But I do think that things like the Lightning Network are attempting to solve those very specific issues where the settlement for a particular transaction would happen close to instantly, which makes it a lot more like feasible for your average like retail transaction. I think that is essentially what the Lightning Network and the second layer solutions are trying to solve. I mean, they understand that the Bitcoin confirmation times make it kind of difficult to use it in the real world, but we're getting closer and closer to finding a really viable long-term solution for that. That being said, there's also a whole bunch of other cryptocurrencies that purportedly are faster than Bitcoin is, and I guess we'll see which ones of these particular solutions will eventually win out. But I do think that the guys who are all working on Bitcoin, the 150 or whatever it is number of Bitcoin developers around the world who are really trying to make this work, they are certainly aware of the fact that Bitcoin is currently quite slow, and I'm sure that is very high on the list of things that they want to improve with the technology.
Yeah, I think those are very valid points, and I think for the medium of exchange use case, it's not necessarily like a monopoly. I guess it's possible that there are multiple winners in that space, just as in software programming, there are multiple programming languages. It's possible that you have different medium of exchange currencies. So that brings me to
definitely.
my next point. So you mentioned earlier that the Bitcoin as a payment rail, it's still it's very early stages, and one of the unique aspects of cryptocurrency that has been covered a lot by traditional media channels is that it's extremely volatile. So if you're using Bitcoin as your financial plumbing and it's very volatile, how does that affect Bloom Solutions?
Right. Well, okay, so there's a bunch of different ways to answer that question, but I guess the simplest version of it is that, if you are using Bitcoin as a means for international settlement, which is kind of how we're using it, you don't necessarily have to stay in Bitcoin very long. And there's an acceptable window of time where volatility is negligible to, basically nothing, right? So if you are only staying in Bitcoin for the length of a single confirmation, which is roughly 10 minutes, then that's an acceptable amount of volatility risk. So the easiest way for a remittance company or anyone else really who is using Bitcoin for international settlement, the easiest way for them to protect themselves against volatility is just not to stay in it very long. And what happens with us is that we accept the Bitcoin from our overseas partners, but we're also kind of selling Bitcoin on, in other venues at the same time, like roughly within the same 10 to 15-minute window. And that could be in various exchanges, or we could be, like working on a deal with, like local brokers or some combination of the two. And that's worked for us for the last couple of years. And, the model has worked for quite a few other blockchain remittance companies around the world too. So we're not particularly unique in that particular respect.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And thanks for explaining that to me. One of the other things that you mentioned recently is that there needs to be more technological infrastructure to support the more mainstream adoption of Bitcoin as a payment rail. I was curious, what other protocol level innovations do you think needs to be made before cryptocurrencies get more adoption and actual real use cases other than speculation for traders who have no real intention to use a smart contract?
Okay, so the infrastructure-wise, I think that we're definitely getting there. I think that with Lightning Network, assuming that actually materializes in a kind of a scalable way, I think the Lightning Network is probably one of the last pieces. I think that what's missing still is education and some kind of just a more standardized regulatory framework. And that might never happen, honestly. Like, I think that standardized regulatory frameworks are probably never going to happen in our lifetimes. I think that every jurisdiction will just have their own ideas regarding how to like regulate things like cryptocurrencies. So perhaps the only thing that we can work on is things like mainstream education. That's kind of the one of the core missions of Bloom as well. I mean, that's one of the reasons why there's only 11 of us, and 5 of us do conferences and workshops regularly. So half the team is out there, like going to like universities or associations or industry conferences or things like that, and telling them about ways that they can safely approach this new and scary technology. A lot of people look at crypto and think that it is, that they're going to lose their money, or someone is going to scam them, or or whatever, their wallet's going to get hacked or something along those lines. And I think that with enough education, people will just become a little bit more used to the idea that this is a thing that this is a tool, a technological tool that you can apply in certain situations to make your life a little bit easier. And precisely what those situations are vary from person to person. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same use case in every single instance. So yeah, sorry. So that's kind of the long-winded answer to, I think what's missing is just more information. I think that just the way that we engage the mainstream public is kind of what we all really need to work on. It certainly doesn't help. There's a lot of drama in the cryptocurrency space, but that's the way the cookie crumbles, unfortunately.
Yeah, those points really resonate with me. I think education is super valuable, and it can be also considered part of the infrastructure that's needed to make these technologies more widely adopted. I think from an economic perspective, yeah, education is needed to solve the problem of asymmetric information, and in doing so, education might create positive externalities for the broader community.
Right.
Yeah, regulation is quite tricky. You just mentioned that regulatory frameworks will probably be different across different jurisdictions.
Right.
According to, at least in the U.S., according to the Coin Center, a lobbying nonprofit group in D.C., similar to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, or EFF, for internet-based protocol. Coin Center says that the definition of money transmission in USA is very broad, and the definitions can be interpreted to require that non-custodial developers of technology are licensed as money transmitters. And the general consensus from industry leaders is that it's not really reasonable to mandate a license for a technologist who is building a network but is not holding consumer valuables. So, explained in a metaphor that might be more easily understood, this is akin to stopping car speeding by requiring costly licensing for construction highway personnel. And this type of logic doesn't really make sense, and it will only mean fewer highways get built. What are the greatest regulatory challenges that you think are in the money transmission space? And I think you guys come in with a very unique perspective because you operate within multiple countries. What are the greatest regulatory challenges, and why do you think so?
Yeah, right. So I mean, this one's a big conversation, right? Because I speak pretty regularly at money transfer conferences, and I've been doing that since 2014, and what the conversation is always about regulation. A lot of these remittance companies look at what we're doing, and then the first question they ask, after kind of ascertaining that we're not scammers, we're there to genuinely try to build sustainable business with them. The question right after that is, how do we deal with the regulators? And that answer kind of varies from country to country. So the Philippines is it's not unique, but it's certainly up there amongst one of the countries that are, I guess you could say, crypto aware in their legislation, because our laws actually allow for certain types of businesses that engage in cryptocurrency. You just have to get a specific license for it. Now, precisely what that license is actually pretty similar to what you were just talking about with what the Coin Center guys were referring to, because here in the Philippines, the license that you have to get looks a lot like a license for a remittance agent, meaning that you are subject to the exact same reporting laws that your average remittance agent is subject to. And that's not trivial to comply with, because your average developer wants to focus on building great payment systems and great remittance systems. They don't want to build KYC systems that comply with a particular jurisdiction. That feels like it's hampering progress rather than helping further it. That being said, we're better off than countries that don't have regulation, because that puts you in this place that is gray, right? So if I were to do this kind of business in someplace like, well, I mean, I guess the really unfriendly countries would be like Nepal or Bangladesh or Algeria. Those countries are very, very anti-crypto, so I wouldn't even try in those countries. And please correct me if I'm wrong with that assessment, but that's definitely kind of the impression I've gotten from like the news that I've read in those particular countries. So the Philippines, South Korea, and Japan, plus a few others, have specific regulations meant for cryptocurrency companies. And that's kind of what you're looking for here, because you can't just shoehorn us into laws that were written, decades ago. It just doesn't work. So some of these laws need to be rethought, and we're lucky where we are because the government has spent a little bit of time trying to rethink these laws. I guess we can argue whether or not it's the correct legislation. I'm not sure. But the point is that it's something that we can comply with and we can apply for a license for, which is, I suppose, still better than not knowing where you stand, which is an unlikely position to be, very sustainable. At the very least, working in the gray areas of a particular market make it very difficult for you to raise money from institutional investors because they are not going to take those risks. So at least now there is a way for young startups to be properly regulated in a handful of countries. And in the countries where no regulation exists, we have to be, we have to have a lot of legal guidance. We don't go in blind. We try to get as much legal advice as we possibly can before we think about a particular country to enter. It just doesn't work anymore to kind of come in, cowboy style and hope for the best. I think it's a little late in the game to still be doing that. And I think that what we'll see over the next couple of years is that those the countries that don't have regulation, they will all catch up pretty soon. They have to, because this is not going to go away. And in fact, the usage of crypto is just going to keep going up. I don't think there's a scenario where it'll just kind of disappear into the ether, so to speak. I don't think that's going to happen anymore.
Yeah, I think some regulation, some clear regulation is better than none. And regulatory risk, that's probably one of the primary concerns of people who may want to enter the space, but they're, as you said, a bit deterred by the regulatory uncertainty. So it's totally valid. I totally agree as well.
Mm-hmm.
The last time we spoke to Israel, he told us more about the project that you guys are working on, Bloom Solutions. Can you tell us more about some of your short and your long-term goals for the project?
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, the easy one is the short-term goal. The short-term goal is to replicate what we're doing with the Philippines and kind of localize it to our neighboring countries. Vietnam, Indonesia, those are kind of the obvious ones. But the rest of Southeast Asia is kind of that's where we want to be. We've got an engine that works pretty well for the Philippines migrant workers. And I guess the next goal will be to figure out how to start replicating that in our neighboring countries. They all have their own migrant workers, and they all have their own diaspora that's kind of all over the world. So kind of trying to figure out how to do that properly is like the first order of business for us. That being said, there's a much longer term goal here where there's a future scenario where it's possible that remittance as we know it will change like fundamentally within the next 5 to 10 years, or I'm not entirely sure what the window of time looks like, but the idea that people still need to rely on a whole bunch of middlemen in order to move money from one country to another, I don't think that chain of value will still exist. The more prevalent crypto becomes, because if you think about it, cryptocurrency is by definition money transfer. It is the most pure form of money transfer because it's done completely electronically and it's peer-to-peer, assuming that both ends of the transaction have access to the wallets of that particular cryptocurrency. So if I have Bitcoin here in the Philippines and you have a Bitcoin wallet where you are in the US, I am capable of making a remittance transaction to you, in minutes or seconds. Purely by virtue of the fact that we both have access to crypto. So if that is the scenario that the world is living within, 5 to 10 years from now, it's hard to imagine that the remittance industry won't change substantially because that's their core product. right? The core product is them helping people make these transactions. But if we can do it ourselves with, a pretty simple Bitcoin transaction on any number of different open source wallets, the industry itself will no longer be the same, I think. So I think so the long-term question is what happens, right? What happens to the remittance industry, in the year 2025 or whatever it is? I think that question is kind of up in the air. However, I do think that one of Bloom's missions is to make money transfer easier, full stop, regardless of whether it means completely upending the remittance industry. And if like one of the possible ways for us to do that is by just finding ways to get crypto into the hands of people in a way that they can understand. Like educate them about what crypto can do, show them how to acquire crypto in a safe and compliant way, and then let them figure out that they don't need to be constantly relying on traditional remittance anymore. It's kind of like the same way that it's not like there was a huge concerted effort to get everyone onto email back in the 90s. People just started getting email addresses. And then over time, they just realized, what? Actually, I don't really need to write this letter anymore and wait for the postman to pick it up from my post box. I can just, send an email as long as, the person who's receiving the message also has an email address. So I think that people will eventually figure that out for themselves. And I think that we're at a tipping point. We're at a moment in time where that is becoming more and more likely. And we just need to make better tools so that people can become more comfortable with this technology. Because at the moment, it's still a little, it's not that great for the average mainstream person. But we're working on it. And I think it's not just us. I think that many crypto startups around the world are trying to figure out a way to get crypto into the hands of the average person in a way that is not threatening or intimidating or unfriendly. And once that happens at a large enough scale, the remittance industry will be completely changed, I think. And it will happen pretty soon, possibly quicker than most of us expect.
For sure. I think one of the most viable use cases of crypto is indeed money transmission. And as Brock Pierce, the chairman of the Bitcoin Foundation, likes to say it, the internet before was the internet of information, and the internet today, or the internet of cryptocurrencies, is the internet of money. So that I think that sums up things pretty well. Brock Pierce is super insightful. And by the way, he just followed me on Twitter.
Oh, cool. Congratulations.
That's like a really minor tangent there. My final question for you is something that I'd like help in explaining as well. You mentioned a lot of how education is so important, and for every person that I talk to, explaining how the cryptocurrency scene now is similar to internet in 1995. There's always that guy who says that cryptocurrencies, while they have a lot of similarities to the internet, they also have a lot of similarities to Linux as well. Linux, the open source protocol. Yep. So a lot of people think that open source protocols won't be monetizable, and I try to explain that the current technology that cryptocurrency enables is ownership of these protocols. Yes, how would you explain to someone who is in the cryptocurrency is Linux bandwagon how cryptocurrency is more like the internet than Linux?
Okay, so I will say that analogies are always imperfect, right? So when we say that Bitcoin is in the same space that the internet was back in the mid 90s, that we're trying to make an analogy based on kind of popularity and acceptance. I don't think that it's a perfect analogy by any means. I think that we're just trying to make it something that people can quickly maybe understand kind of superficially. But I think it's not exactly perfect, and neither is it perfect to say that Bitcoin is actually a little bit more like Linux, because you know um I the internet runs on Linux, so the servers that are that run things like Facebook and Google, they're all kind of versions of Linux. So if you tell me that Bitcoin is going to end up like Linux, that that's kind of huge. That's like telling me that it will run all of the world's finance, but it'll do it in the background. That's not necessarily a bad thing either. In fact, there's a book from an author that I quite respect. His name's I'm gonna butcher his name. I believe it's pronounced Saifuddin Amos. He just came out with a book called The Bitcoin Standard, and I've been looking forward to reading this. I just bought it yesterday, and he talks about how Bitcoin. It's possible that Bitcoin will end up becoming the kind of the reserve currency. So it might not necessarily be the currency that people spend on a daily basis. It might be the currency that we use to balance the economies of the world. Like kind of like a global reserve currency, I suppose. That's an interesting kind of thought as well. I don't know if that is what is going to happen, but I think that I don't think we should discount these other potential scenarios. I think that Bitcoin wins. It doesn't necessarily have to win by having 7 billion people using it. I think that it could win by having major economies kind of using it to balance their to settle between themselves. I think that that's a perfectly acceptable future for Bitcoin. I don't know if that's what's going to happen or not. And does the analogy still work for the internet? No, I don't think so, because at that point you're really talking about Bitcoin as if it's going to be like a background thing. But that doesn't change the fact that it will be immensely valuable, and it will change the game for so many players that are possibly not able to play at the global level. One of the meetings we had earlier was with these guys from traditional banking here in the Philippines, and like they were having us walk through our business and kind of describe how we were using crypto and stuff like that. And one of them kind of stopped me in the middle of my sentence. He said, hold on, you guys are basically telling me that you don't need to have access to the Swift network anymore in order to do international transactions of any size from one country to another. And I said, yeah, sure, yeah, that's one of the use cases for Bitcoin. And he was saying, though he was blown away by that kind of realization, right? Because the Swift network and to a lesser extent other players like maybe Earthport they're gatekeepers for international transactions. You have to be a financial institution in order to kind of play at that level. You must be a bank in order to participate. But suddenly we have access to this completely open, completely democratic, and completely decentralized network where value can be exchanged. You don't have to ask for permission to join. So whether or not you're one guy trying to buy coffee or maybe clothes off of a website, or whether you're a remittance company in South Korea and you're trying to send money to another remittance company in the Philippines, whether or not that's your situation or something else entirely, I think that there's value to be found in a network that no longer requires you to to pander to the gatekeepers. And that sounds a little libertarian of me, so maybe I'm kind of revealing my political leanings there. But
Yeah.
I think that the world will be better off to have alternatives. So maybe that's how I would like to end the thought, right? Having an alternative is always better than just having the one way that people do things. Because if anything, it creates competition, and maybe it makes the traditional players a little bit more aware that maybe that's not a bad outcome as well. I think that the ending that we're all hoping for is, it's not obvious yet. I think that it will resolve itself over the next few years, but I don't know that it's possible for us to completely predict exactly where it's all going. And for me, the most important thing that I can contribute to this space and this community is to just help people understand it better, and give them tools to participate in ways that are safe for them. I think that's the mission that I have for myself, and that's the mission that Bloom has as a company. Make crypto safe for people, help them figure out how to use it in their own daily lives, and that's kind of that's the broad vision that we've always had for our company.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Luis. You're obviously a very thoughtful guy, and I learned a lot from you today. So I think the banks, the business associations, and maybe some of the regulatory companies that you guys talk with regularly, I'm pretty sure they're very lucky to have you help guide them as well. Yeah, I just wanted to thank you so much, Luis, and hope to eventually meet you in Manila when you get back.